Well, welcome everybody to the Garden Tomb. We're glad you're here after a long flight. And I think you'll find by the time we've been right round the garden that you have the most beautiful visual aid here of the whole Easter story. And this garden is a real oasis in Jerusalem. In fact, our Jewish lawyer referred to it as the jewel in East Jerusalem. And it's a place where we love to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus as well as remember his death on the cross. This garden was first discovered by a man called General Gordon, and he used to stay in the house on top of the walls. He used to sit on the rooftop and study the topography of Jerusalem, because in the 1880s many scholars were asking if the alternative site inside the city walls, known as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, was the right site. And so a number of scholars and archaeologists were asking questions and looking for an alternative site. We're not in competition with them, because here in this garden we're more interested in the person who rose from the dead than the place where they put his dead body. Now, if you'd been here centuries ago, this whole area was an execution site, because it was first of all a quarry, a place where much stone was cut, limestone for the many building programs here in Jerusalem, prior to the time of Jesus and right down to the time of Herod, because the rock here used to join the rock on which the walls are built, and it's a stream of rock that goes right through the old city, known as Mount Moriah, and many feel this is the most northerly point of Mount Moriah, almost 3,000 feet above sea level. And if you know the story in the Bible, it was at Mount Moriah that Abraham was about to offer his son Isaac, but before he did so, Isaac asked where the sacrifice was, and Abram replied by saying God would provide for himself a lamb. And centuries later, Jesus came to Jerusalem to be the Lamb of God who would take away the sin of the world. When this particular quarry was finished, it became an execution site, a place where Jewish people in Old Testament days, if they broke the law, were brought here to be stoned to death. It's still referred to as Bet HaSekila, place of stoning. And it would be in this area that Stephen, the first Christian martyr, would have been stoned to death. But if you know the story as recorded by Dr. Luke, he tells us that before Stephen died, he had a vision of Jesus, not sitting, but standing. And I love to think that Jesus was giving him a royal welcome into heaven, the first man to lay down his life for Jesus. It's considered now that about 200,000 Christians worldwide are martyred for their faith. Stephen here was the first. Many scholars feel that when the Romans would have come here to Jerusalem, they would have used this large area for their form of capital punishment, which was crucifixion. They needed a large area because they nearly always crucified people on public holidays, so that as many as possible could come and watch. And for centuries, nobody built here at all. It wasn't until 1956, about 60 years ago, that the bus station was built in front of Skull Hill, when it was part of the West Bank and under the Jordanians. But if you have a copy of our Garden Tomb book, you'll find inside a picture of how it looked, like a big open-air amphitheatre, an ideal place for the Romans to use. So where might Jesus have been crucified? We know he was condemned to death in the old city, in Pilate's judgment hall. And after he'd been cruelly scourged, he had to carry the crossbeam to Golgotha. And in the Bible it says, Jesus, bearing his cross, went to a place called Golgotha, where they crucified him. And many of you probably know that Golgotha is an Aramaic word which means a skull, and the Latin equivalent is Calvary. So this has been known as Gordon's Calvary for over 100 years. And so we can picture Jesus coming to Golgotha, where he was impaled on an ugly Roman cross. And that cross was lifted on high and dropped into its socket. And yet in the midst of all that cruelty and mockery, the first words to escape the lips of Jesus were really wonderful. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. For me, that's a prayer that's got no parallel in human history. To think that the Prince of Life could pray for those who were putting him to death. To think that he could ask God to forgive them rather than to judge them. And for me, the cross is all about forgiveness. And I would say to you today, it's far more important to know forgiveness through the death of Jesus and peace with God than it is to go home and say, I went to Jerusalem and I found the hole in the ground where the cross stood. Because many people come to Jerusalem getting tired out, looking at stones and sites, and they miss the spiritual significance of what happened on those sites. Now there's a little verse in John's Gospel that you might have missed. It simply says, near to the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden. So we're going to walk through the garden and see what we can find. So on the center platform here, and then I'll bring the picture over and talk about it for a few moments before we go down to the tomb. So how do we know there was a garden here 2,000 years ago? Well, the first piece of evidence is here in my hand. It's a huge underground water cistern. It holds almost 200,000 gallons of water. That's about 1 million litres. And it's reckoned to be the third largest water cistern to be found in Jerusalem. And it's right here in this garden. But look at it carefully and see how beautifully it's been carved out of the rock without any of the high-powered equipment that we can use today. And so when you look at it, you realize that only a wealthy man could have hired enough labor to have done that. And there's one man who fits the picture, and his name is Joseph of Arimathea. Now there are two archaeologists like Dame Kathleen Kenyon who says this goes back to the Herodian period, and Konrad Schick, another archaeologist from Germany, says it's pre-Christian. So it seems it could well have been here at the time of Jesus. And if you know the story well, you will know that it was Joseph who went to Pilate to ask for the body of Jesus. And we're told in the Bible that he was rich. We're told that he was a secret disciple for fear of the Jews. And yet he went boldly to Pilate to ask for the body of Jesus. That was a beautiful thing he did, because he literally rescued the body of Jesus, because it was normal practice in those days to throw the bodies of criminals into a common grave. And then with the help of Nicodemus, the man who went to Jesus by night, those two disciples, they went to the cross. And though they were noble men, they did a very menial task. They took the bruised and blood-stained body of Jesus from the cross. With love and care, they wrapped it in linen with the spices Nicodemus had brought. And they carried it through a garden with a little group of women following, who watched as they laid his body in a new tomb cut out of the rock. They watched as the stone was rolled over the entrance. For me, Joseph is an unsung hero. You don't hear many people talking about him. He rescued the body of Jesus, and then he gave up his family tomb for Jesus, cut at great expense out of the rock. But if you stop and think about it, he got his tomb back 3 days later. And there's an important message in there for any of us who seek to follow Jesus, that whatever we sacrifice for him, he will always bless us in return. I'm glad to see a few heads nodding. So why did they need all this water? Over here I have a picture of the wine press, because just behind me here, as you walk around, you'll see this wine press. And it's a very large wine press. And this is the area where they would throw the grapes and trample them, and the juice would come through the crack into the well this end, where it would begin to ferment. So the hills around here would have been covered with vines, and they were growing grapes and producing wine here many, many years ago. So we've been to Golgotha, we're now in a garden, and the picture continues as we go down to the tomb. When we go down there, do watch where you put your feet. Some of the ground is very uneven, and it's possible you would twist your ankle if you're not careful. So do watch where you put your feet. So if you follow me, we'll go down to the tomb. So behind me here is a genuine Jewish tomb, and it's amazing how it fits the Bible story. First of all, it's near Golgotha, it's in a garden, and it's cut out of solid rock. It's not a natural cave like some of the burial places were at that time. And everything about this tomb fits a wealthy Jew of the time of Jesus, though some would date it earlier than that. And you can view the burial place from outside. And in front of me here is a channel for the rolling stone. And that stone would have been a few tons, which is why the women were saying on Easter morning, "Who will move the stone for us?" One of the things that strikes you as you look at the rock are those old blocks in the wall, and you probably wonder why they're there. Well, there was a crack that went right through the rock surface. And when I see cracks in the rocks around Jerusalem, I think of what happened when Jesus died. Supernatural things. Do you remember? The sun went dark, the earth shook, and the rock split. And it seems to me the whole of creation was identifying with the incredible sufferings of the Son of God. And the crack came right through the wall, so these blocks were put in to prop up the rock surface, because part of this was damaged and part of the doorway came out as well. So the original height of the doorway was about here on my waistline. Why do I mention a detail like that? When Peter and John came running to the tomb, what did they have to do when they arrived? They had to stoop to look in. It's only a detail, but the mark of an eyewitness, of somebody who was actually there. I have in my hand a plan of the tomb that will help you when you go to view it inside. You can see it's a large tomb, the sort of tomb that only a wealthy man could have afforded to have cut out of solid rock for himself and his family. This first area here is known as the weeping chamber, where they would go in to grieve over their loved ones. That's the area to which the women were going on that first Easter morning to lay out their spices to anoint the body of Jesus, their last act of love for him. It's a large room. You can get quite a number of people in there. On the other side, you have the burial places. And when you look at it, it's this one that can be visible, can be seen from outside. And you can see it's slightly different. There's a place cut out for the feet, whereas this one seems to be incomplete. If that is the right place, then when Peter and John came running to the tomb, they could look in and they could see the linen clothes lying, but the body had gone. And the picture I have in my mind is of a butterfly escaping a chrysalis, because the clothes were left undisturbed. And we're told that there were two men in white apparel, one at the head and one at the foot, and they were asking, "Why are you seeking the living amongst the dead? He is not here, he has..." We can do better than that. He is not here, he has risen. And that was the great thing about the tomb of Jesus. It was empty. Many great religious leaders, prophets, priests and kings and gurus of different kinds have lived and died, and their bones are still in their burial places. Jesus is unique. On the third day, he rose from the dead, proving that he was the Son of God. And there's a wonderful verse that you can look as you go up the steps and turn to your right, which says, Jesus Christ declared with power to be the Son of God through the resurrection from the dead. And it was outside another tomb, the tomb of Lazarus, that Jesus said some wonderful words. And I built my life on those words. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. And he turned to Martha and said, do you believe this? And sometimes I turn to my guests and say, do you believe this? And sometimes people say, yes. Others look as though they don't really know. And every now and again we have the privilege of helping somebody in this beautiful garden to put their faith and trust in the risen Jesus. And they go on their way rejoicing. And that's absolutely wonderful, because that's really why we're here. So you have a beautiful visual aid of the whole Easter story. Golgotha, a garden, and in the garden a tomb that fits the biblical description. But we never try and prove it's definitely the place. Many people think it is, and it could be. But I would say to you today, it's far more important to have a personal faith in our risen Lord than it is to go home and say, well, I think I found the place where they put his dead body. Do you realize the disciples, as far as we know, never ever went back to the tomb of Jesus, like we go back to the graves of loved ones? Why was that? They knew he wasn't there, and he'd given them a commission to go out into the world and to preach the gospel, to share the good news that there was forgiveness through his death and new life through his resurrection. If you look at the rock face, can you see it was cut back into the shape of an arch? And there's a place here and there for beams. And when they excavated here, they found that somebody had built a Christian chapel. It would seem in the Byzantine period. So that's an interesting thought. If that's a genuine Jewish tomb, which it is, why did somebody later build a Christian chapel here? And inside we've had a cross, a Byzantine cross, with the letters Jesus Christ, Alpha and Omega, written on the cross. And also one final thing to point out in the wall that I always find interesting, and you can see sketched into the face of the rock, again probably going back to the Byzantine period, so it will have been here since the 6th century, and you can see the cross in it, and there's a line with a little leg. So what have they drawn? It was a secret sign during days of persecution, a little bit like the fish badge. And if you go to Rome, you'll see it in the catacombs in Rome. So what have they drawn? Well, there's a line with a little leg at the bottom. That's how they drew a ship's anchor. Why would they use an anchor as a symbol of faith and hope? In Hebrews chapter 6, Jesus is described as the anchor of the soul, sure and steadfast. And they needed an anchor point for their faith in days of persecution. And I've been through one or two tragedies in my own life. If ever I was glad to be a Christian and have my faith anchored in Jesus, it was then. He gave me strength beyond my natural resources to go on. So it was a very important symbol then, and it can be to us today. So thank you, friends, for coming. You can, if you wish, get a copy of our Garden Tomb book from the shop, which has some lovely photographs in, and it's a lovely thing to take away with you. So thank you for coming. It's been my privilege to show you around the garden and to give you a brief tour, a little briefer than perhaps I would normally do. But thank you for coming, and enjoy the rest of your time in Israel. God bless you.